Hey everybody, Alex Miller at Capnion here. I was reading the news that LinkedIn thought I should read this morning, and I was thinking I can put basically all of this in a single narrative, which is that the lockdown phase of pandemic and then the crazy stuff we did to try to keep the wheels turning during that time are pretty big events with a long tail of effects, and lots of them are still with us. So I'm going to go through a number of stories that I saw today and explain why all of them are in different ways. Really the same story about extreme economic choices we made and other countries made and everybody made all over the planet, really, during pandemic. And a common storyline on top of that situation that's different in every individual case, but is overall the same, is that we're really off equilibrium now. So generally, what everybody's doing at work all day, I would argue, is the world was working 10 minutes ago. So you typically don't have to tweak it that much to get it working again. If you've got an established business, for example, with a lot of customers, it's a different thing to keep that going than it is to get something new going. And what you can see in a lot of examples is that if too many people get too far from their equilibrium, it's really hard to get back because I'm making a change, trying to get my life stabilized, but that change affects you. That's a new thing you have to react to get yourself stabilized, and we just go in a circle, and my life is destabilized again. So there's lots of examples of this that come and go. Here's a few ones I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to talk about, just what happened during pandemic. What were the big economic events, and how are they still around? I'll talk about big tech layoffs, which I think are both more and less severe than they really appear and are very much an artifact of people trying to react to pandemic and now trying to unreact in a sense. I'll get a little weirder. Banking, of course, is a residue of what happened. I'll talk about housing prices as well. And then my favorite, more interesting than it should be, macroeconomic topic is different parts of a chicken you might buy and eat and how the prices tell you something about what's going on. And that was also one of the articles today. They were trying to talk to me about chicken prices, which I think is more interesting than you might realize if your heart was cold to it. So during pandemic, the lockdown phase, we've probably all tried to forget because I don't know that anybody had a good time, but there were a lot of jobs that just got turned off. For example, if you worked in a restaurant in some form, restaurants were just closed by order of the government, most places, most of the time. And then if you gossiped around, there were a lot of other crises that followed from this. Restaurants buy things from somebody else. That person is now in free fall financially. And so what we did, and this took a lot of different forms, extreme quantitative easing, paycheck protection programs, stimulus checks. The government was really trying hard to just inundate everybody with money in the hopes that everybody had enough money both to eat and live their life, and then hopefully it would also flow through the tubes some kind of way like it had before and keep the machine running. So I'm going to show a couple graphs here while I'm talking. M2 is roughly all the money in existence, the amount of money that's in existence, and specifically in a vaguely liquid form, so it's cash in your pocket or money in your checking account. Your stock portfolio doesn't count. What you can see in the first graph is that the amount of money had a pretty boring upward trend, growing more or less with the economy forever. And it has this extreme dislocation that comes with pandemic. And that's what I'm talking about. There was this flood of new money, way more money than there normally is. And it got in different people's hands and it's sloshing around right now. And so this is already the first off equilibrium problem. We have more of an inflation problem than we used to because there's too much money sloshing around and not enough stuff to buy. That's how you get inflation, the very short story. You can take this data and you can look, well, if pandemic hadn't happened and we'd continued this very boring trend, where would we be now? There are $2.6 trillion approximately, when I did some of these numbers, of extra money sloshing around that we shouldn't have. So that's a whole awful lot. And then also, it's not evenly spread. I think some people, you could say, have already spent their stimulus checks. Other people save the money. They might decide to spend it later. So we don't even have a great sense of where all this money ended up and what it means. So now I'd like to talk about big tech layoffs. I'm going to take the opportunity to harp on corporate governance here. I think it's especially interesting to analyze big tech. They're large publicly traded companies, and like everybody in that boat, they've got to come back every quarter and tell an exciting story about how much money they're going to make. So during pandemic, everybody was still free to be on the internet and do internet-centric stuff. So these companies were doing well. They've got to have a world domination plan for every quarter, and they can't come out and say, okay, well, I don't think our luck's going to last. This pandemic thing is just a one-off. So they had interesting world domination plans in reaction to that pandemic lockdown world. And you can look at their extreme expansion relative to their subsequent layoffs. So Facebook, I believe, during pandemic expanded their headcount from around 40,000 to around 70,000. So that's nuts. So to return to my theme here, during pandemic, everybody was out of step with reality and had to move. If you were doing some work in person, you basically got shut down. And then if you were doing some kind of work that involved the internet, they couldn't get enough of you. And now we are trying to once again acclimatize to a new equilibrium now that that world is over and it's slow going. And particularly on the more blue collar labor side, a lot of those people that got let go didn't go back. And this also contributes to the inflation issue. If you look at this graph, a ton of people just stopped working. And one potential driver of inflation is that restaurants and similar have to pay people more and more money just to get them to show up. That's once again an artifact of the world is off of equilibrium, unstable, and is trying to find its stride again. Now to move on, I got a few more comments like this. Banking is a little bit obvious. A lot of the things that the Federal Reserve Bank did to stimulate the economy passed through banks. I hope I've convinced you that there's maybe an unusual and disturbing amount of money sloshing around, and that's something the Federal Reserve naturally should worry about. Banks are also the point by which they hoover the money back out. And so once again, we're off equilibrium. This actor is trying to do what they can. Banks are just on the firing line, so there's specific reasons why they're having trouble, but they're just standing next to the scary money vacuum more than you are, and so naturally they're affected first. Housing prices are another example. I would say this is one of many financial markets that got a little uncoupled from any kind of fundamentals. There was certainly a dynamic at one time where everybody had these big piles of cash and they were kind of standing around waiting to bet, is the housing market going to go up and down? So I just saw today it was going down, took a sharp U-turn. I think a lot of people are still waiting, looking at the housing market because they know that it's gyrating around. But then this just makes it gyrate around more. This is once again a story about being off equilibrium. Finally, to get to my favorite, chicken prices. So it's a well-known thing, at least to me. In bad times, the price of chicken wings goes up. So it's typically as good as your yield curve inversion or whatever recession indicator you like. If the price of chicken wings per weight passes chicken breasts, that's an indication you're in a recession because chicken wings are custom comfort food. They're usually supposed to be cheaper. This tends not to be true. And I saw, once again, one of the articles LinkedIn was trying to show me is that, well, they're trying to sell smaller chickens, but they're more expensive, and there's this disconnect. So whatever kind of supply chain problem you have, there's also another reality of everybody is spooked and emotional about the economy. And that affects what kinds of meat people like to eat, in addition to the layer of what kind of money do they have to pay for it. So once again, the story is that everything got a little weird and off during pandemic, and we are still, in basically every news article I read on LinkedIn, trying to find our way back to a stability that we really have not achieved yet.